So this is the beginning of a series on the cost of insulin. Over the next couple weeks, we're going to talk about the major insulin companies and how they've cornered the market, followed by how drug companies set prices, and lastly, we're going to cover what measures are being taken to lower these prices. So let me set the scene. January 23rd, 1922, in a Canadian General Hospital, a 14-year-old boy lies in his bed with a diabetic coma. At his bedside are two very enthusiastic young doctors. Then fast forward to 1923 when those same two doctors win the Nobel Prize for their miracle drug, insulin. A miracle that they wanted to share so badly with the world that they sold the patent for just $1. So then how is it possible that this $1 miracle that was meant to be shared with everyone is now a billion-dollar industry that not too many people can actually afford? And how is it that this same billion-dollar industry is pretty much shared between 3 companies worldwide? Well, let's talk about it.
And then he cabled me and said, "I've got insulin, it works, come home quick." We ran out of insulin too. Some of our patients who had been treated and were well died from lack of insulin. That was a hectic time, particularly for me, because I was supposed to make it again, and of course we did rediscover how to do it, and the secret can never be lost.
During this timeline, I'm going to cover a lot of different subjects, and there's going to be a lot of names thrown at you. But in particular, I want you to pay attention to just 3 names. And those names are August Crowe, John G. Fitzgerald, and George Claus. And I'll explain later. So let's start from the beginning. 1920. August Crowe, a Danish professor, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine. In 1921, Banting, a young surgeon, and Best, a master student, started testing a hypothesis at the Department of Physiology of the University of Toronto, under the supervision of the notorious physiologist John MacLeod. Now soon after, James Collip, a biochemist of the University of Alberta, who was serving part of his sabbatical at the Department of Pathology Chemistry Toronto, joined the group as well. January 11th, 1922. Excited by the good results of the extracts prepared by Collip and administered to dogs and rabbits, Banting proposed MacLeod to start human trials. The first human injection of Banting and Best were given about half a mile away from their university lab at the Toronto General Hospital. The injection was given to a 14-year-old boy named Leonard Thomas, and it was a huge success. February 25th, 1922. An agreement was made at the Connaught Antitoxin Laboratories, a non-profit organization run by John G. Fitzgerald, based on the campus in the University of Toronto, that was located just 2 floors below Banting and Best's lab. So for Connaught Laboratories, this was a huge deal because it eventually opened the door for a patent for them later on. But initially, Banting did not want to associate his name with a patent because in the 18th and 19th centuries, if you were a university or a researcher and you associate your name with a patent of something you discovered, it was pretty much frowned upon. The doctors in the University of Toronto eventually agreed to the patent and discovery as a maneuver to prevent anyone from securing a profitable monopoly and stalling the process of producing and distributing the extracts to the patients. December 19th, 1922, Banting, Best, and Collip registered the patent for the property of insulin, and it was sold to the University of Toronto for $1. And so here it was, the moment of truth, the moment when all the cosmic powers of insulin and medicine were in the hands of just one body, and that was the University of Toronto, the body from which a 3-headed monster grew. But first, an unrelated but totally related event happened. Dr. August Crowe, remember him from the beginning, the guy who won the Nobel Prize in 1920? He now was on the Nobel Prize committee, and in 1923 decided he wanted to cast his vote, which he voted for Dr. Banting and MacLeod, who eventually went on to win the Nobel Prize. More on that in a bit. So let's talk about those ugly heads. Head number 1. In 1923, Connaught Antitoxin Laboratories, the Canadian nonprofit run by John G. Fitzgerald, with the approval of Dr. Best and Banting, continued to work tirelessly to keep up with the demands of the new miracle drug. But unfortunately, Fitzgerald did not have the resources, being a nonprofit school, to keep up with the demand and to manufacture these extracts on a large commercial scale, which brings about head number 2. 1923, Taking in consideration the production problem and the humanitarian urgency of a large-scale distribution, the University of Toronto settled down an agreement with the American George Close and his pharmaceutical company, granting them a 1-year exclusive right for producing and selling at cost insulin in the Americas with the help of a Chicago meat packing company called Swift & Co. And head number 3, August Krogh. Yep, there's that name again. The Nobel Prize winner from 1920. This same guy who helped nominate Banting and MacLeod for the Nobel Prize. Well, this guy, he was given permission to manufacture insulin in Denmark. And then in February of 24, was also granted a Danish patent. So here's where it gets interesting. Within 1 year of the patent coming out for insulin, 3 guys owned the license to massively produce and distribute insulin. And these guys used this opportunity to springboard their companies into pharmaceutical history. Now you might be saying, who the heck is August Krogh? Well, you may have never heard of this guy other than the Nobel Prize, but you've probably heard of the name of his company, Novo Nordisk. So what about this Klaus, Close, however you say it guy? What's his deal? Well, in 1923, when he helped gain the insulin patent for his company, a company where he was currently the director of research, you may have never heard of Klaus, but you've definitely heard of the name of the company that he's worked for, which is Eli Lilly. And that leaves just one guy, Fitzgerald. And you think, well, Fitzgerald worked for a nonprofit for a university. There's no way this guy could ever benefit from it. But you're wrong. Unfortunately, the nonprofit called Connaught Antitoxin Laboratories was sold to the Canada Development Corporation and then was dismantled and merged several times until finally being acquired by a company called Sanofi. I'm sure you heard of those guys. Now, I'm not a huge conspiracy theory person. As you can see, I got the crazy wall going on, but as I was doing research on this, it was blowing my mind how many of these things connected, how close-knit of a group these guys were. So yes, Krogh is Novo Nordisk, Klaus is Eli Lilly, and Fitzgerald ended up somehow becoming Sanofi. But what does that mean to you? Well, at the time, it really didn't mean much to anybody. Insulin was being sold at cost or even below cost, and it was being distributed worldwide. Meanwhile, the University of Toronto was getting a 5% royalty on all the insulin that was being sold, and they were getting paid. But not even 3 years later, in 1926, a letter emerges. This letter was written by F. Lorne Hutchinson and explains that John MacLeod had become upset with the news that the University of Toronto was profiting too much off of their 5% royalty. He was convinced that reducing the royalty would help promote lower insulin costs. And in this letter, he also enclosed the names of 10 existing companies who currently had a license for insulin to manufacture and distribution. And I thought, awesome. The University of Toronto is actually reaching out to other companies because before we only had 3, now we have 10 a couple years later, and they're trying to distribute this thing worldwide at a low cost. Now the royalty thing is a completely separate matter. The thing that really caught my eye in this letter is those 10 or actually 7 other companies that were mentioned that now had a license to manufacture and distribute insulin. Unfortunately, as I did a little bit of research and digging, I realized that those companies at that point couldn't compete against the big 3. A few of them still exist and they do sell other type of diabetic medications, but most of them were acquired by Novo Nordisk, Eli Lilly, and Sanofi. So what can we gather from this information? Well, number 1, the major players in insulin distribution and manufacturing have been around before you were ever even born, unless you're over 100 years old, kudos to you. The other thing that really sticks out to me is that these companies have held on to a patent that was sold for just $1 that was never intended to be sold for more than cost. So join me next week. We're gonna take this a step further and we're gonna talk about how these drug companies set their prices and how they've been able to hold on to this patent for about 100 years. So hopefully today's video was entertaining and informational. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. I'm Ben, I'm Type Me. See you next week.